My name is James Stevens with Exploring God's Library. Please join us as we explore historic Christian events and personalities as we read through the Bible together each year. In this session, we'll be reading from the History of the Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford, abridged by Daniel Webster, on the occasion of the 400th anniversary of the Puritans' landing at Plymouth Rock in America on November 11, 1620. Chapter 2. Their departure into Holland and their troubles there, with an account of some of their many difficulties. 1608. Being thus compelled to leave their native soil, their lands and livings, and all their friends and familiar acquaintances, was much of an undertaking and thought marvelous by many. They regarded it as an almost desperate adventure, and a worse misery than death, to go into a country they knew nothing about, where they must learn a new language and get their livings they knew not how, it being a dear place and subject to the miseries of war. They were not acquainted with trades by which the country doth subsist, and had only been accustomed to a plain country life and the innocent trade of husbandry. But these things did not dismay them, although they did sometimes trouble them. Yet this was not all, for though they could not stay, yet they were not allowed to go. Their own ports and harbors were shut up against them, so that they were forced to seek secret means of conveyance, and to bribe and fee the sailors, and to give extraordinary rates for their passages. Furthermore, they were often betrayed, and both they and their goods intercepted and surprised, and they thereby put to great trouble and expense, of which I will give an instance or two. A large company of them purposed getting passage at Boston in Lincolnshire. Now you might be able to see this. You can't really see it, but this is England, and it'd be up here in Boston, in this area. Oh, I'm sorry, Boston's up here, and of course they cross the German Ocean to the Netherlands over near Amsterdam. A large company of them purposed getting passage at Boston in Lincolnshire, and for that object had hired a ship and made agreement with the master to be ready at a certain day to take them and their goods in at a convenient place where they would all be in readiness. Although he did not come to them on the day appointed, he came at length and took them away by night. But when he had them and their goods aboard, he betrayed them, having plotted with the searchers and other officers, who took them and put them into open boats, and there rifled them of all their effects, then carried them back into the town, and made them a spectacle to the multitude, which came flocking on all sides to behold them. The result was that the greater part, after a month's imprisonment, we dismissed and sent back to the places from which they came. But 7 of the principals were still kept in prison and bound over to the assizes. That's a criminal trial or an inquiry by the court. The following spring, an attempt was again made at another place to cross over. They met with a Dutchman at Hull and made an agreement with him, hoping to find him more faithful than their own countrymen. Accordingly, at the appointed time, the women and children with their goods were sent to the place in a small bark, which had been hired for that purpose, and the men were to meet them by land. It so happened that they were there fully a day before the ship came, and the sea being rough and the women sick, they persuaded the seamen to put into a creek close by, where the bark lay on ground at low water. The next morning the ship came, but the bark was fast and could not stir until noon. In the meantime, the ship's master, perceiving how the matter was, sent his boat to get the men whom he saw ready and walking about on the shore. But after the first load was got aboard, and the boat was ready to go for more, the master saw a great company of soldiers, both horse and foot, with bills and guns and other weapons, for the country was raised to capture them. The Dutchman, seeing this, and having a fair wind, weighed sail, weighed anchor, hoisted sails, and put out to sea. The poor men who had just been taken on board were in great distress on account of their wives and children, whom they saw left without their help, and they themselves had no clothing except that on their backs, nor hardly a penny about them, all they had being aboard the bark. They would have given anything they had to have been back again on shore, but it was all in vain. There was no remedy. They must sadly part. Afterwards a fearful storm arose, and they were out 14 days before they landed at their port. But to return to the others, whom we left on the shore. The rest of the men were in the greatest danger, and prepared to make their escape before the troops could surprise them. Those only remained who could be of the most assistance to the women. It was pitiful to see the condition of these poor women, weeping and crying, some for their husbands, who were carried away in the ship, others not knowing what should become of them and their little ones, and still others in tears at seeing their little ones hanging about them, crying for fear and shaking with cold. Thus captured, they were hurried from one place to another, and from one justice to another, till in the end the judges did not know what to do with them. For to imprison so many women and innocent children for no other cause but that they wanted to go with their husbands seemed to be unreasonable, and to send them home was as difficult, for they had no home to go to, having either sold or otherwise disposed of their houses and livings. I might relate many other notable troubles which they endured in their wanderings, both on land and sea, but I haste to other things. Yet I may not omit the results that followed, for by these public troubles, in so many eminent places, their cause became famous. Though some few shrunk at these first conflicts and sharp beginnings, yet many more came up with fresh courage and greatly animated others. So that in the end, notwithstanding all these storms of opposition, they all got over to Holland, some at one time and some at another, and some in one place and some in another, and met together again according to their desires with no small rejoicing. The departure from England was effected with much suffering and hazard. The first attempt in 1607 was prevented, but the magistrates checked the ferocity of the subordinate officers, and after a month's arrest of the whole company, 7 only of the principal men were retained a little longer in prison. Such was the flight of Robinson and Brewster and their followers from the land of their fathers. Their arrival in Amsterdam in 1608 was but the beginning of their wanderings. They knew they were pilgrims, and looked not much on those things, but lifted up their eyes to heaven, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. Bancroft. Chapter 3. Settlement in Holland, and manner of living there. Having come into the Low Countries, they saw many goodly and fortified cities, strongly walled and guarded with troops of armed men. They heard a strange and uncouth language, and beheld the different manners and customs of the people, with their strange fashions and attires. But these were not the things they much looked on or considered, for they had work in hand, and under the kind of war to wage. For though they saw fair and beautiful cities, overflowing with abundance of all sorts of wealth and riches, yet it was not long before they saw the grim and grisly face of poverty coming upon them like an armed man, with whom they must buckle and encounter, and from whom they could not fly. When they had lived in Amsterdam about a year, Mr. Robinson, their pastor, and some others at best discerning, thought it was best to remove. For these and some other reasons they went to Leyden, a fair and beautiful city. But, lacking that traffic by sea which Amsterdam enjoys, it was not so beneficial for their outward means of living. Being thus settled after many difficulties, they continued many years in a comfortable condition, enjoying much sweet and delightful society and spiritual comfort under the able ministry and prudent government of Mr. Robinson and Mr. William Brewster, who was an assistant to him. If at any time any differences arose or offenses broke out, as will sometimes happen among the best of men, they were always met and nipped in the head betimes. Such was the mutual love and reciprocal respect that Mr. Robinson had for his flock and his flock for him, that it might be said of him, as it once was said of the famous Marcus Aurelius and the people of home, that it was hard to judge whether he delighted more in having such a people or they in having such a pastor. But, seeing it is not my purpose to treat of the several passages that befell this people, whilst they thus lived in the Low Countries, I will mention a particular or two to show the good acceptation they had in the place where they lived. Though many of them were poor, yet there were none so poor, but if they were known to be of the congregation, the Dutch would trust them in any reasonable matter when they wanted money. Because they had found by experience how careful they were to keep their word, and saw them so painstaking and diligent in their callings, that they would even try to get their custom, and to employ them before others in their work, because of their honesty and diligence. Again, the magistrates of the city, about the time of their departure, a little before, in the public place of justice, gave this commendable testimony of them. "These English," said they, "have lived amongst us these 12 years, and yet we never had any suit or accusations against them." I think I'm going to go to chapter 4 this time too. So, reading a little longer. Showing the reasons and causes of their removal. After they had lived in Leyden about 11 or 12 years, and sundry of them had been taken away by death, and many others had begun to be well stricken in years, or the grave mistress Experience, having taught them many things, the prudent governors, with sundry of the sagest members, began both deeply to apprehend their present dangers, and wisely to foresee the future, and think of timely remedy. And first they saw and found the hardness of the place and country to be such that comparatively few would come to them from England, and fewer still would bide it out and continue with them. For many came to them, and many more desired to be with them, but could not endure the great labor and hard fare with other inconveniences which they underwent and were contented with. They saw that although the people generally bore all these difficulties very cheerfully and with a resolute courage, being in the best and strength of their years, yet old age began to steal on many of them, so that it was not only probably thought, but apparently seen, that within a few years they would be in danger of scattering or of sinking under the burdens, or both. As necessity was a taskmaster over them, so they were forced to be of such not only to their servants, but in a sort to their dearest children, which not a little wounded the tender hearts of many a loving father and mother, and produced likewise sad and sorrowful effects. Though their minds were free and willing, yet many were so oppressed with their heavy labors that their bodies bowed under the weight and became decrepit in their early youth, the vigor of nature being consumed in the very bud, as it were. Lastly, which was not least, they had a great hope and inward zeal of laying some good foundation for propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts of the world. Yea, though they should be but even as stepping stones unto others for the performing of so great a work. These and some other similar reasons induced them to carry out this resolution of removal. The place they thought of was one of those vast countries of America, which are fruitful and fit for habitation, where the natives are only savage and brutish men who range up and down like wild beasts. When this proposition was made public and came to the consideration of all, it raised many favorable opinions and caused many fears and doubts among them. If they should go, the hardships they would have to undergo might possibly cause the death of some or all of them. For they would be liable to famine, nakedness, and the want in a manner of all things. The change of air, diet, and drinking water would probably cause sickness and disease. Those that should escape these miseries would be in constant danger of the savages, who are cruel, barbarous, and most treacherous, furious in their rage, and merciless where they overcome, not being content only to kill, but delighting to torment men in the most bloody manner. It was further objected that it would require great sums of money to furnish supplies for such a voyage, and to fit them with necessaries than their consumed estates would amount to. It was answered that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and must be undertaken and overcome with corresponding courage. It was granted that the dangers were great, but not desperate. The difficulties were many, but not invincible. For though there were many of them likely to happen, yet they were not certain, and it might be that many of the things feared might never occur. Others, by provident care and the use of good means, might, in a great measure, be prevented, and all of them, through the help of God, by fortitude and patience, might either be borne or overcome. True it was that such attempts were not to be made and undertaken without good ground and reason, not rashly or lightly, as many have done from curiosity or hope of gain. But their condition was not ordinary. Their purposes were good and lawful and urgent. Therefore they might expect the blessing of God in their proceedings. And even if they should lose their lives in this action, yet they might have comfort in the same, and their endeavors would be honorable. After many debates on the question, it was finally concluded by the greater part to put this design into execution